people on the webinar, so I will go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to join us today. I'm really excited to be hosting this webinar. It's a huge topic, both in the Greentech Alliance and I think in the climate discussions in general, and touches like lots of different actors. So really looking forward to this. My name is Emma Patmore. I am one of the co-founders of the Greentech Alliance. For those of you who don't know, we are a global network of climate-facing startups. So we are existing since May of last year, with the aim of basically driving forward the conversation and supporting startups that are working in the climate space. I am also the senior marketing strategist for Ecoligo. So we are a company that develops solar projects in emerging markets, and we finance these through crowd investing. We're also actually working with Namene Solar on some of our solar projects, so they've installed quite a few of them. So yeah, good also for me to have lots of touch points in this. First of all, I'll be introducing our speakers, and then we'll be hearing from Bernardo on what it takes to get projects offset. We'll be hearing from Amy on the buyer side, and Johannes will also be giving his valuable input from the investor side as well, and then we will have a panel at the end. Feel free to add your questions in the chat, and we will try to address them as much as we can at the end of the webinar. And hope you have fun and enjoy. And first, I will pass on to Bernardo to introduce himself.
Thank you, Emma. First of all, thanks for hosting this webinar. We're very pleased to join and have this lively discussion. I'm Bernardo Lazo. I'm Director of Sustainability at Namene Solar, and as Emma mentioned, we develop solar projects in development markets, but also in the UK at a commercial and industrial scale. But we also design and manufacture solar lights that are meant to be distributed mainly in developing countries, in areas where people don't have access to electricity. And later on, I will present more on that and how we are using carbon finance to scale up. Just to give you a little intro, this is an example of the lights that we are distributing. So it's quite small, but it's a big impact that it delivers. Once you aggregate several numbers. So yeah, thank you for joining this panel and the webinar.
Great, thanks, Bernardo. Amy, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Sure. So my name's Amy McPherson, and I work at Plan A. My previous role at Plan A was in developing and buying, I guess, the credits, the carbon offsetting credits that would form part of the portfolio that we would offer as our end-to-end sustainability solutions for companies. So our software that enables companies to measure, reduce, and offset their carbon emissions. So yeah, I'll be presenting more about what it takes to buy credits and what we look for in presenting our portfolio to corporates.
Fantastic, thanks. And Johannes, finally, please introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, well, thanks also from my side. So I'm Johannes Ebeling. I've been working in nature-based solutions, if you want to call them like that, for about 15 years, particularly on forestry in the tropics, forest conservation, forest restoration. I'm currently managing director of Biocarbon Group, so that's a very specialized investor in this field, giving early finance to projects that conserve forests, that work with communities to restore forests, that also improve agriculture. And another focus we have is on cookstoves, so reducing unsustainable fuel wood use cookstoves, and all of that is developing countries with a focus recently on Africa. Sort of the investor side, also the forestry and nature side, and I can also speak about marketing and that if needed. So thanks for that.
Great, fantastic. Then I think we can jump straight into it. And Bernardo first is going to give us an overview of how to get your project certified and why that's important for your carbon strategy.
Excellent. Thanks, Emma. I'm going to share a presentation, a couple of slides, just to be able to guide you through our process. I hope you can see my screen now.
Yeah, we can see that.
Excellent. So I'm just going to briefly introduce Namene Solar in the context of this project, and then providing a bit of background of why carbon credits, why are they relevant as an option for financing of certain projects, technologies, or interventions that lead to emission reductions or carbon sequestration. And then I will go through the process of what it involves a project certification. No, I won't go into great levels of detail, but give you the basic understanding of what is required and the steps involved. And then I will talk from our experience for certifying a project for solar lights distribution. So as I mentioned, we are a solar company that has designed and manufactured an award-winning solar light. It's a portable solar light that has been specifically developed for this market, to targeting those households that don't have access to electricity, that they normally would use candles or kerosene that lead to different fumes and indoor emissions that are obviously harmful and that they're expensive. And the lights are obviously aimed to replace those with a very simple and accessible technology. And by reducing the consumption of fossil fuels, obviously that leads to carbon mitigation. And that's why we are seeking to monetize that carbon mitigation in order to expand the distribution of our solar lights. It's a portable solar light, so it can be carried, it can be used at home. It comes with our own stand, and so therefore it's quite versatile. And as a company, we also develop commercial projects, and as Emma mentioned, some of those that are being also crowdfunded through Ecolingo. But why carbon credits in our case? Because they're a financial tool that can help finance projects that otherwise might not be commercially feasible, or that they might require an additional revenue stream to become economically attractive. So it's a way to monetize this value of the carbon reduction or the sequestration of a project. No, in the case of forestry, for instance, tree planting obviously would help to provide an additional revenue stream to plant and preserve those trees, or to implement other interventions to increase the carbon stock in nature, or to introduce new technologies that are either more energy efficient or simply they displace other sources of emissions. No, it's mainly a results-based financing. That means that the money doesn't come up front in order to develop a project. It's more you develop the results, achieve the emission reductions, issue the carbon credits, and then you can monetize those credits. So it often comes with additional, or requires additional sources of finance, at least for the first stages. But it definitely allows companies to have a bit more visibility on these activities and these projects. This carbon revenue can help either to cover some of the operational costs of the project, or to reduce the price for accessing this technology. No, like it's the case that we're doing with for us with the solar lights. There is, however, it doesn't apply to any technology or every project. There is a minimum scale to cover the certification costs, which is I would say is roughly 20 to 10 to 20,000 tons of CO2 per year, or carbon credits per year, to cover the certification costs. Going back to the very basics, a carbon credit is the same as a carbon offset, and a carbon credit can compensate the emissions of organizations and individuals. That means that if an entity emits 1 ton of CO2, it can be compensated by a carbon credit, by an activity that it takes place elsewhere. No? And this is a global market, simply because the CO2, it's around the atmosphere, and if you reduce in one place, it has an impact overall at a sort of global level. So that provides a very, in that sense, a very flexible mechanism. No? And they can be used for compliance purposes under certain markets, emissions trading schemes, or certain regulatory regimes, or for voluntary purposes. The carbon credits can be created based on 2 approaches, either as a carbon reduction, which could be, as an example, avoided deforestation, or a fuel switch from coal to natural gas, or from natural gas to biofuels, or by introducing renewable energy that it's displacing other fossil fuel energy consumption or generation, or through energy efficiency. No, there are other examples of carbon reduction projects, but this could be a range of those technologies. And the other approach is actually to sequester carbon that it's already in the atmosphere, and that's mainly through natural-based solutions, which is reforestation, improved forest management, organic soil management, or blue carbon, which is capturing carbon and sequestering on the sea or seabed, or on coastal environments. So these are the 2 main approaches to generate carbon credits, and both have the same goal, which is climate mitigation. No, many of these activities obviously have other impacts, positive impacts in terms of social and environmental benefits that we might talk about them a bit later. No? And how do you calculate a carbon credit? You need to compare a baseline scenario and then the project scenario. And just to give an example, in our case, the projects that we're implementing by introducing solar light is to replace kerosene or candles for lighting, which generate, because these are fossil fuels, they generate carbon emissions to produce light in the baseline scenario. In the project scenario, by introducing our lights and displacing these fossil fuels for lighting, those CO2 emissions are avoided or reduced. And therefore, those are converted into emission reductions and eventually a carbon credit. No? Just as an example, one solar lamp reduces 92 kilos of CO2 per year. This is a default value that comes from the carbon methodology. Each specific intervention might have a different value, and it might need to be calculated, or it's a default value. It really varies, but the same logic applies to other technologies and interventions. No, even if it's the type of trees that you plant, they can also absorb carbon at a certain rate. No, those are calculated, monitored, and eventually audited to be issuing this carbon credit, which enables the carbon financing, basically. And all of these carbon credits need to follow certain key principles to demonstrate that these reductions and this carbon sequestration took place. They need to be real. They need to be exposed, that they already happened. They need to be additional, which is an important term, that it's activities that wouldn't have taken place otherwise, and that they are happening because of carbon finance. and not because that's the market trends or because it's regulated by governments. So it's an important concept and a tricky one sometimes to demonstrate in some projects. That it's measurable, obviously that needs to be accounted and quantified or calculated, the amount of emission reductions that takes place in order to preserve the environmental integrity. No? If we go back to the previous slide that showed a balance between 1 ton emitted and 1 ton reduced, that's the environmental integrity that projects need to achieve. That in order to really compensate one emission, the other one the reduction really needs to take place. No, and that's why these principles are so important. No, it needs to be transparent and it needs to be verified by a third party. No, so these principles are translated into most of the carbon standards and need to be followed. And some of these projects, or the certification, it can be complex because of this requirement to comply with these principles. No, but the market has been there for 15 years. There have been quite a lot of lessons learned along that time, and standards have evolved and improved. There's some still issues that can be further improved or make more efficient. But these are the key founding or main pillars on which the market functions and the standards are based. So how to certify a project? First, you need to choose a carbon standard. There are plenty out there. The most recognized, I would say, it's the verified carbon standard, the VCS, and the gold standard. And in North America, the American Carbon Registry and the Climate Action Reserve. There are other, perhaps more niche standards, but which one you choose will depend on the project context, location, and activity. Some of them might not be eligible in the location where you want to develop them, or some others there's not an applicable activity or eligible activity. No, for instance, the VCS, I think it's the broadest that covers a much larger set of activities, particularly for nature-based solutions. Whereas the gold standard focus more on activities that are community-based and that are focusing on carbon capture and not so much on avoided emissions from deforestation, for instance. I'm going to talk a bit more about gold standard certification because it's the experience that we have at Namene, the standard that we have chosen to do. And that's mainly because on one side, the certification helps to monetize the carbon reductions that we generate, but also to certify the contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's one of the most stringent carbon standards. It requires to comply with the social and environmental safeguards from the very beginning, from the design of the project, conducts extensive consultation processes during the project planning to engage all the different participants or people that can be affected or benefited by the project, and at a community level or at the land use project level. This is very important to get it right from the beginning and to validate and verify that this design matches what the communities really need and require. And the standard also helps to quantify, monitor, and report these impacts in a sort of structured and credible way. No, instead of just making wild claims about project impacts. The gold standard provides the tools and the requirements to say, well, if you're making these claims that you're benefiting X amount of people or having this impact on the environment, you need to demonstrate it and you need to monitor over time. No, so it's not only on paper but also during the operation that the projects need to show the performance over time. So that gives more credibility, no? And as many other standards, it requires to be audited by a third party. No? So actual certification process is divided in 2 steps. One of them is the design certification, which is while planning and preparing the project. It involves the stakeholder consultation, a baseline assessment, additionality assessment, all the document preparation. And this can take time, depending on the complexity of the project, on whether there's already a methodology available, whether there are similar projects in that country or not, and whether the technology is understood of how to claim those emission reductions and how to calculate it. Then it goes to a third-party audit, which involves even a site visit to check that what it's planned and said it's actually going to happen or happening. And then it goes into project design review by Gold Standard itself. And at that point, the project, if it passes all these hurdles, it receives the Gold Standard certification. That means that from that point onward, the project is eligible to generate the carbon credits, once it starts reducing emissions. And then the second part is the performance certification. Once the design is fully certified and approved, then it involves the implementation, which in our case is the distribution of the solar lights to households. Once these lights are deployed, we need to monitor in detail where these lights are going. And again, from project to project, the monitoring requirements vary considerably, but we monitor not only how many lights are we selling, but also what are the impacts that these lights are having into the communities. And that involves a combination of sample surveys or visiting the projects, and eventually also to have a third-party audit. And for every period, let's say 1 year of emission reductions that have been achieved by the lights that have been already distributed, we submit a monitoring report with a calculation of how many tons of CO2 the project has reduced. This gets audited by a third party as well, with site visits to confirm that this actually took place. And then it goes to the Gold Standard for final approval to actually issue the carbon credits, which at that point then can be traded to the BR buyers. So it takes time, this process. During the project implementation, this is a recurring step that every year or 2 years, the monitoring it's continuous, but it gets submitting reports, and the carbon credits can get issued during a crediting period, which can last 5 to 7 years, depending on the standard. And now I'm going to give you the example of how Namene got involved in doing one of these carbon projects. The case of using carbon finance to scale up the distribution of Pico solar lights, and how, despite that these are big lights, through aggregation we can achieve big scale and impact. I'm going to give you the example of our project in Zambia, which involved distributing lights, or the distribution of lights in 4 provinces in rural households that where currently the electricity penetration is very low. It's around 20-25% of all the households, and most of them use candles or kerosene for lighting. And this project seeks to distribute 652,000 solar lights throughout these 4 provinces that will reach up to 1.5 million people. So despite that, it's small lights, obviously through aggregation and through deep penetration in these rural villages and districts, we seek to benefit a large number of people and to bring them into the sort of first step of the clean energy ladder. The project got certified earlier this year, and we already distribute over 10,000 lights, and we are ramping up the distribution this year, obviously, to reach the targets. But in order to develop the project, we had to conduct extensive baseline assessments to calculate, what are the users consuming currently, how much they're spending on kerosene, and you would be surprised how much they spend compared to their purchasing power for lighting. And we conduct also several stakeholder consultations just to get feedback of what are the users and the family needs. One characteristic is that we worked closely with rural clinics on the stakeholder consultations, but especially with rural schools, because children can benefit obviously from extra hours of study at night through the lights, and we are using the schools as an aggregation point for raising awareness on the benefit of the project, and also making it an aggregation point for sales and for after sales customer support. We would say that the key success components of this project is to find the right product, which in our case, many of these stakeholder consultations informed the design of the project, of the product, and were incorporated. To find the right distribution model on how to aggregate the sales channel in order to be efficient and to be able to deploy the lights fast, but also in an affordable and economically feasible way, and to set up the right systems, both the IT systems and management systems to work in a complex environment, in rural areas, and as well, obviously, to set up the right team and partnerships. And partnerships are very important to work in this type of projects, particularly when it involves working with communities. So local knowledge is key to find a good balance. And this project delivers significant contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. 3 of these SDGs are being certified by Gold Standard, particularly no poverty, because it's reducing the expenditures and saving millions of dollars over the project lifetime, by providing first-time access to clean energy for lighting, and by reducing CO2. There are other additional benefits that the project brings, like better education by enabling extra hours of study, reducing indoor air pollution, also has great impacts in health. But those are more complex to quantify and report. It might require statistics that we might not have access to directly. So in our case, we focused on 3 particular SDGs to be certified, but that doesn't mean that the others are not happening. It's just a matter, as a project developer, one needs to choose to what extent one reports, quantifies, and certify these SDGs. But the idea is that these also enhance the value of not only monetary, but also what the project delivers overall. And just to give a bit of perspective on the challenge for distribution of the lights, this here is a map of Zambia, on the 4 provinces that we are distributing our lights, overlapped on Europe. So it's quite a large stretch of land that we need to cover in difficult conditions to reach sometimes. So it's quite a complex logistical challenge, and our project has required for us to innovate in our business models, in the way we do sales and distribution, and also in the way we monitor the whole process. And just to wrap up, here were the takeaways, and maybe we can have later on the discussion, but here are our takeaways on carbon certification. One is that it opens doors for financing and enables more visibility to projects and products. But it's important to check if your project is eligible under the current standards and methodologies before committing big resources, because it's not on like all size fit all. One key aspect is that the devil is on the detail, where in terms of the amount of carbon credit you can generate per hectare of forest planted or per activity. There are quite a lot of details that need to be validated first. No? So rely on specialists that they can save you time and money. No? And the other point is that it's a long journey, so you need to be patient but persistent. So it takes time to design a good project, and it takes longer time to execute it properly. And one of the key aspects of execution is monitoring, because if you don't have data, you don't have VRs, and therefore you don't get the money that you were expecting to get. So I cannot highlight this less. It's really key. And the other final aspect is just keep an eye on the carbon market for changes in regulations and trends, because it's a very dynamic market, particularly in the voluntary space. At this point, I want to leave it at that. Thank you for the time. I'm sure now can Amy provide the perspective from the buyer side.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Bernardo. And there's quite a few questions in the chat as well, so feel free to give your answers to those. And yeah, on to Amy to hear your perspective.
Wonderful, thanks, Emma. That was a great presentation, Bernardo, and it definitely lays out a lot of the details about the lengthy process that it is to go through to verify and certify projects. And this is especially important from the buyer's side when you're working with companies, because throughout the last years, there's been a lot of, I guess, negative press about carbon offsets, a lot of projects gone wrong that have had more negative impact than they have had positive impact. You see from the company perspective and who we buy for, that there tends to be a lot of skepticism around what types of projects to go for, and this is where standards like Gold Standard, being a very reliable and trusted brand, is super important for the companies that we work with, because they want to know that whatever they're using to offset the emissions that they can't reduce themselves, they want that to be really impactful and to also be reliable as well, which leads into a lot of the conversations that I tend to have with the companies that we work with at Plan A. The types of credits they're looking for are always tends to be towards the nuance end. So reforestation tends to not be the biggest demand that we have, but projects like the solar lights that are doing different things, because this is what they can use to be able to market themselves in a different way. I guess a lot of the purpose of offsetting carbon is also as part of the CSR strategy of a lot of companies. So what they really want to be doing is maximizing the impact that they can have through these projects. So usually what companies are looking for is a minimum of 4 or 5 SDGs that are validated through the project. So knowing definitely the social and the community impact that these projects have are really, really important. So being able to give really good impact statistics on, I guess, the granular effect of one CO2 through a solar light project or through a cook stove project, the direct impact that has on the community is really important. So being able to translate that. But what I do when I curate a portfolio is I tend to look into the verification standards. So at Plan A, we solely work with only Gold Standard projects. And this is just because our experience with Gold Standard has meant that projects have undergone so much verification that they're very reliable and quite trustworthy in that regard. So when I curate a portfolio, I try and curate it based on the companies that we have in our pipeline that are our customers, and I curate it based on where their supply chains are, because companies usually want to have an impact in a locality that is where they work. This becomes a little bit more challenging, especially because it's harder to validate projects within Europe and other countries under certification standards like the gold standard. But you see a lot of companies that are really wanting to have more of an impact on a local level. And this is when I tend to look towards their supply chain to be able to find projects that have impact within that vicinity. But really, it's just down to the impact. And also, it's also down to the price as well. So with the gold standard, projects are priced really fairly, which is super important from a buying perspective, because if we're shortcutting project developers, it means that the project itself it's that money that is being spent on the carbon offsets is not always filtering down in the best way possible into the community. So being able to buy at a fair price is really important to us, because it means more impact can get spread to the community there. So yeah, our buying perspective is mainly just the impact that it has on a social and community level is really, really important. Wonderful. So I think that's about all. So I can pass over to Johannes if you want to go up next.
You're on mute, Johannes.
I think we were unmuting at the same time. I would invite any sort of specific questions, maybe, rather than give an overview. I mean, I can generally say that I've chosen early on, and Biocarbon has chosen to work in the land use sector because there is so much focus on technology. It's sort of like we're a technology-focused society, and we sort of forget how much activities there are in the land use sector. Deforestation is not really a visible issue in Europe and the US, for example. And there's a lot of mitigation potential across the world, especially in developing countries, that concerns land rehabilitation, concerns improved agriculture, and so on. Honestly, there's also a lot of potential for that in Europe, more sustainable agriculture, and the US. But there's generally in the climate, whole climate debate has been very much technology focused and very much focused on the types of things we know from our sort of privileged title standpoint here. So I can get into more technical questions if there are. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe to start, you can just give us a bit of an overview on like a project level of why like the differences between tech-based and nature-based solutions. For example, comparing trees and solar lights.
Yeah, sure. So Bernardo used some examples in his presentation. I don't know if everybody caught that so quickly. There's generally the same distinction in nature-based solutions as you can imagine for technology. So there's some avoidance of emissions. So if you avoid the cutting down or the burning of a hectare of forest or of a tree, let's just say, it's also avoiding emissions that would have resulted from that tree, right? The tree stores carbon, and good soils, agricultural soils, store carbon, and they can be released. And so you can avoid those emissions through good management. And often that actually means working with agriculture rather than on the forest side itself. And you can remove carbon from the atmosphere. And that's why there's been a lot of focus also recently in sort of global discussions on forestry, again, and on agriculture, because there isn't really any commercial and large-scale proven technology to remove carbon from the air. There's a lot of sort of press when there is something that's new technology says that's invented. It's usually very expensive to do direct air capture, for example, of CO2. And trees have been doing that for billions of years. So there's large-scale proven technology for that in place. And if we look at net zero emission targets for companies, or rather for countries, maybe for the global situation, you have to take carbon out of the atmosphere, number one, to stabilize the climate, but you also will always have emissions you can't mitigate easily or at all right now technologically. And so to compensate for those, you will need some nature-based solutions.
Okay, and so there needs to be, kind of, in your opinion, then more of a balance of different types of VERs to be able to fight the climate crisis.
Yeah, so I mean, one note maybe on that, I don't believe that VERs can fight the climate crisis in themselves. So there will always be a need, one can't expect, I guess, voluntary offsetting or any type of offsetting to address climate change on a global level. There's always going to be a lot of policy input going to be needed. And a company or a consumer can in the end also decide, I think, which type of project they feel more attracted to or which fits their sort of business story or personal just passions more, because you can't. I don't think any individual offsetter or sort of client has to have the ambition to cover the whole global, profile of emissions. But yes, overall, in terms of mitigating climate change, there absolutely has to be a balance between those two. I think we have, depending on what you count into that sector, if you include agriculture, you have between 30 and 40% of global emissions are in the land use sector. So it's hard to get around.
And I think on that point, Amy, it would be really interesting to hear your perspective. Obviously, carbon offsetting has received bad press in the past, or still currently, in terms of giving people an excuse to justify the behavior or lack of behavior change, rather. What's your thoughts and what's your experience with Plan A on that?
I mean, I think the main experience that I've had at Plan A is that, yes, it's been, I guess, avenue for companies to be able to greenwash. And I think partially that's down to just wanting to offshore the impact or offshore the impact of their carbon emissions. So not making any feasible changes within their own behavior as a company or within their organization to be able to reduce emissions, and then relying on carbon offsetting to be their main action on climate change, I think is what causes a lot of problems there. And also, I guess from the perspective of larger companies, particular airlines, setting up their own projects that maybe haven't undergone third-party verification or in different countries around the world has caused a lot of problems for communities there. So really cheap projects that haven't undergone any type of verification, it tends to be really harmful rather than impactful, and it's just a mechanism for greenwashing there. But I think that's where it comes down to balancing your strategy on climate, on taking action on climate change, and that would be through I guess reducing your impact, reducing your CO2 emissions, and then offsetting what you can't feasibly reduce yourself, and then working towards wanting to reduce most of your emissions. Yeah.
Okay.
Could I maybe add something to that? Just to sort of like maybe avoid that there's an unbalanced impression in the audience. I think verification standards have come in sort of in the last 15 years, certainly in the last 10 years, to avoid exactly that. And yes, some airlines and so on do their own sort of in-house projects to cut corners. But if you as a customer, as a company or individual, look at established standards such as those that Bernardo has put up, those are exactly created to avoid these problems. So I would sort of just want to avoid an impression that in general the whole sector is flawed or anything like that. The standardization has come in, just like it has come in for organic foods. Before there was an organic certification, everybody says this is natural and whatever, and so now you have a standard that's still debatable, of course, and you have higher and lower standards, but that standardization, I think, has tended to get around these problems, and you will always have, in every area of life, you will have some black sheep, and there are organizations that love to focus on those in every area of life again as well, right? Like a lot of people are opposed to capitalism and markets and so on, and will find debatable aspects about projects and sometimes skewed perspectives as well, but not to debate that there are problems, of course, when it's not well certified.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think one of the hurdles that I have seen from project certification are the topics that you brought up earlier, Bernardo, just with like the time and all of the processes that you have to go through. Obviously, this is important so that you make sure that projects are, of course, of a very high standard. But I'm also curious to know whether you think that this is improving in the sense of becoming more efficient or easier for companies to certify their projects.
Yeah, I think it's a very important comment to speak about, mainly because it's a trade-off, because in order to achieve high quality, it needs to go through a very rigorous process of planning and on reporting and quantifying the impacts, either negative or positive, and to address those impacts in case they're negative. But on our experience, those processes have also helped to inform the design of the project, no? To ensure that, if you haven't consulted this type of stakeholder, you also involve them from an early stage. That might bring to, raising an amber flag for the project and say, actually, we need to change a bit our design or our course of action. So I would say it can be a painful process, but it also is a useful process to go through, no? So yeah, it takes time, but I think at least for the type of projects that we're aiming to achieve, that it's a carbon project, but it's much more than that. It's a development project. It's we're trying to eradicate kerosene in a country. So obviously it will come with all sorts of different challenges, regardless of the carbon market. But going through this structure helps to design a good project. Nevertheless, some of the processes are still slow. They're still very much paper-based. And the standards are working into improving some of the aspects. They are looking into ways of digitizing some of the paperwork required, perhaps more remote audits, and even talking about using blockchain to sort of build into a more, non-changeable source that encrypts all the information along the whole chain. So it gives credibility from the moment the credit is generated all the way that it's transacted, and to speed up that transaction process. So that there's still a lot of room for innovation in that side. But I think in terms of how to quantify the emission reductions, it's still a bit cumbersome. There have been some efforts to make it more either based on using standardized baselines for certain sectors that you just apply a default factor or a benchmark factor, but those have proven to be more challenging to implement in practice. No, so there is still room for improvement, but yeah. Going through the process also forces you to have a robust project and a good monitoring process also for management to know what's happening to your project.
Yeah, you mentioned that the number of SDGs that you can basically prove that you're impacting has a direct correlation to the sort of monetary benefit you can get from the projects. I think when it comes to things like solar lamps or more tech-based solutions, there are quite a lot of SDGs that relate to that. But on the nature side, there's also a lot of benefits of reforestation or of rather protecting forested areas or sustainable agriculture. And I'm wondering, Johannes, if you think those are also reflected enough in the SDGs. From my perspective, I think there's a bit less, like maybe just one or two on that topic. What's your thoughts there?
Sure. I mean, as to your second thought there, one of the SDGs is life on Earth, preserving life on Earth. So I would think that's probably more important than many other SDGs. So if you sort of put that on the same footing, everybody's life on Earth, including all living species, that should be maybe would deserve maybe more than one. But in general, yes, I think there are a lot of those that relate. A lot of impacts that relate to SDGs. So one important aspect for forest conservation, for example, is that if you look at poverty-driven deforestation, for example, in order to mitigate that, there's this sort of colonial picture sometimes of building a fence around a forest or something like that. In reality, you have to work with people on improving agriculture, on improving nutrition, on improving education and so on, in order to enable community-driven conservation or also community-driven tree planting. So by their nature, not just the fact that the forest is conserved, but the actual underlying inputs that allow a community not to cut down a forest have huge impact, development impacts. There's somewhere.
Sorry.
No worries. And then also, of course, preserving trees, preserving forests has huge impacts on the availability of fresh water, often on forest-derived foods, on whether it's fruit collection or hunting. A lot of sort of rural communities rely a lot on ecosystem services of forests, and of course we all do globally in terms of rainfall patterns, in terms of climate mitigation, and so on. So there's a lot of things that aren't exactly captured in the SDGs because they're very human development focused, and we sort of tend to forget as a normal life that a functioning ecology is the basis of all human life. But there are a bunch of SDGs that are reflected, that are relating rather to nature-based solutions nonetheless.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying there. I can highlight one of the Greentech Alliance members, Melly Bees. Their founder, Ana de Lima, has also been in this, and they're doing exactly that in the Amazon rainforest. Mm-hmm. There was a question in the questions before that I was interested in for Bernardo about the costs of doing this process. So you said, I think earlier, that you need to set aside around 10,000 or 20,000 credits per year, but can you kind of give us in a bit more concrete terms what the actual costs of getting projects certified is?
Sure. I mean, this is a sort of rule of thumb estimate, and it really depends on the type of project. But basically, if your project is going to generate, if it's a small scale project and it's going to generate less than 10,000 tons per year, it's likely that the transaction costs to get it certified are going to be, through the project implementation cycle, higher than what you would get for the carbon credits. No? Obviously, that will depend on how the carbon credits pricing evolve in the future. If instead of selling at an average of 5 tons or 20 tons, you start selling at $50 per ton, then those economics really change. No, but the majority of the costs come into all the document preparation initially. That really depends on whether you do it internally or you rely on consultants. As well as the actual audit, hiring the auditor, and then paying a fee for the actual certification. No, depending on the standard, you can pay something between, I think, 10 cents per credit to all the way to 30 cents per credit that you issue. No, that's what sort of the revenue for the standards when they issue the credit. And an auditor can charge you, anything between 10 to maybe $30,000 or euros, depending on the project and a particular stage. So, yeah, it really varies from project to project. No, but if, let's say, you need to invest, $50,000 to $150,000 for developing a project, you need to make sure that you are recovering that from the sales of carbon credits at the end of the day. No.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if Johannes, you want to also, chip in on that.
Or maybe aspect. You can. Maybe you could also speak a little bit to the pricing of carbon credits and what's actually influencing that.
Right. I think the first question Bernardo pretty much covered. For very large sort of forest conservation projects, for example, it can be a lot more expensive still if you have to analyze satellite data and purchase that maybe, and can be a very long process and a very expensive process. So small projects just generally, unless you have grant funding and very privileged sort of pricing, some people do it through the networks. There's often a very skewed economics, and people also often don't value their internal staff time. Is my experience, of putting very qualified people on these projects that in the end generate marginal benefits. In terms of pricing, was your question of nature-based versus technological, or just generally price differences? I can't hear you actually.
Sorry. Yep. Yeah. So both actually, the kind of perspective of the tech versus nature-based side, and also just what is influencing that in general.
Yeah. So the pricing maybe in general. So as we're speaking about voluntary, nobody's obliged to buy those, and so depending on your motivation to buy them, you might be willing to pay very, very different pricing. So I've seen prices from 50 cents to $20 and more. And you can very much argue whether 50 cents enables any project activity to get started. it might be projects that are just struggling and struggling to become not insolvent and that sell for that price, but you can't launch anything new at that level. And we're also moving away from that. So for a long time, the market has been very demand driven. So there was an oversupply of credits because nobody cared, frankly speaking, about climate change for a few years. And now that's, I'm exaggerating, but there was, a large undervaluation of the threat to life on Earth, let's say. And now that's changing a lot, and you see an uptick in prices. You see attractive projects actually having sold out very quickly after issuance, often after verification. And so generally, I would say, and maybe the others can complement me on this, if a project has a lot of core benefits, it's still much more likely to attract higher pricing. So a lot of people care, maybe more than about climate change, care about the human development story, about education, about gender equality, about benefits for kids, also about biodiversity, right? Like we have, if you compare, which you hardly actually find for that reason, if you were to compare sort of a monoculture eucalyptus plantation or something like that compared to, a mixed native species plantation or conservation of a biodiversity-rich natural forest, it's no comparison in terms of pricing, and for good reasons, because you have so many co-benefits. But you can ask in general, though, if it's strictly speaking only about a ton of CO2, and all of these standards are assumed to reflect that and are additional. Strictly speaking, there shouldn't be a difference, but most people, in fact, care about many other things other than climate change implications.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. After having conversations with lots of companies about the criteria that they look for in the types of projects that we offer them, the ones with the human development and community development tend to be the ones that they're the most interested in. So yeah, anything that has a lot of, like the gender equality one has been a very interesting one that we've gotten a lot of interest from. So things like solar projects do contribute a lot to that as well, because I mean they give the ability to read after dark and to take the to be able to do the education after when it's dark. So yeah, these types of things are also very important from a buyer perspective.
Maybe the inverse has been hydro projects, maybe especially even large hydro projects, where it's very hard to argue that there's any benefit beyond the carbon mitigation. In fact, there's almost always some negative impact on the environment, and often also on people, resettlement, and so on. And sorry, and for that reason, they've basically disappeared, I would argue, at least the large-scale ones from voluntary markets.
Bernardo, do you have anything else to add to that point?
Yeah, perhaps that there is this challenge that the carbon credits are trying to be more recently commoditized, as 1 ton of CO2 is 1 ton of CO2, and to the voluntary market is not very liquid, and there are now initiatives to make the market more liquid and more transparent, which I think making it more transparent in terms of pricing would be definitely a good step forward. But also the uniqueness of each project shouldn't be lost in translation during that sort of process of making them more fungible and more commoditized. Because each project is unique, and buyers are buying also the story behind it, and what all the other aspects that are not CO2 related that a project brings, and unfortunately, only the carbon is being valued as a ton, price per ton, but there's no price per poverty reduction, or price per life saved, or price per hectare saved. So it's try to be encompassed into the VR pricing, in the voluntary market, but sometimes it's not the case, and I think that's something that it's not a straightforward answer that I have of how to resolve that, but I think at least to be able to transparently and efficiently report on the SDG contributions might make a more credible way to ask for a premium, and for buyers to say, well, I'm buying a premium because these projects are not SDG washing. No, they're really going through the what it's required to demonstrate their impact, in a meaningful and transparent way.
Yeah. What does the market look like? So of course it's very easy for companies if they are going through plan A and they have somebody like Amy who's just already checked out a portfolio and created a portfolio for them. How else do companies at the moment go about buying carbon credits? Is it kind of like an online market for that, or what does that look like?
Yep. Did you want me to answer that one, Emma?
You can answer that, or any of the others either. Yeah.
Sure. I think you can buy directly from the Gold Standard platform. Is one. There's also loads of different retailers. You can sometimes buy directly from project developers platforms as well. So some have on their website the ability to buy some of their credits. Their Climate Fund is a really good one to do that through. So yeah, there's many options online. If you Google carbon offsetting, the amount of platforms that show up it's quite dense.
Yeah, and maybe to add as a systematic sort of approach to that, if you're interested as a smaller company, so large companies, just want to add, often do tenders now. It's right, they do a market tender, everybody bids. That's really only going to work if you have a large volume to buy. Otherwise, I work more with the VCS, with the Verified Carbon Standard, and with the Gold Standard, but I think they both have a very similar database. If you say, well, I want something in that country, or I want this technology or anything like that, there's a project database where you can filter by those criteria, and then you can go on. Every project will have some sort of a website, or there will be some sort of a way to find out who operates it, and you can contact them. So if you have very specific ideas of what you want to support, what your employees might want, or what's aligned to your business, you can actually be quite systematic rather than just go to any of the intermediaries that are going to just pitch where they have the highest margin. And that's sort of fine, right? They're a business, but that's not necessarily, the price is not necessarily going to reflect what the project gets. So if you have very specific ideas and you have a meaningful volume, then do get in touch with the projects directly. And I'm saying that even though we, of course, also are an intermediary and agglomerator. Aggregator.
Yeah. There was a question as well earlier on about how to essentially manage your finances until you actually get the standard, until you have the credits also to sell. And you mentioned there that that's where like equity and loans and that kind of thing come in. Is there a way that people can pre-finance projects or like support the development of projects, particularly if they think that that's particularly meeting their goals?
Sure. I think there are different ways. One of them is if companies feel compelled to have like either exclusivity on purchasing the project, or to have a bit more ownership on the claim of participating into that project, not only from I'm buying carbon credits, but I'm also helping develop this project. It might be that they can provide some of the resources, whether it's human resources or funding at the development stage. That's one option. And yeah, the other is to at least sign a forward agreement in which you say, well, at the time that I generate the carbon credits, you already secure a buyer at potentially a fixed price or an index price. That at least that enables you to have a bit more security on the revenues, and based on that you might get a loan or find other sources of financing. And I think in the not too distant future, there's probably a role for crowdfunding. Some of these initiatives. I'm not aware of anyone doing it just yet, as specifically for carbon, but a lot of the activities that are done similar to what Ecolingo does, it's through crowdfunding, and people get this sense of I'm doing something good. I need to be patient sometimes to get the returns, but I will get it. Carbon credits are not a sort of retail investment vehicle, I would say, because it's complex, it's risky, and it has sort of failed in the past to be a retail investment asset, so to speak. But certainly there could be ways to support projects that are actually generating carbon credits, and help them to get into the operational phase.
Yeah, I can see that.
Emma? Yeah, I just wanted to stress what Bernardo said at some point in the middle, because it was maybe easily missed. So there's a possibility to just buy on the market for this year's needs, right? Like this year I had these emissions and I'm going to buy, 37,000 credits. That's good, but because the market is not liquid and it's so highly volatile, it's much, much better for a project if they know for the next 5 years or even 10 years, or even if it's just 3 years, I'm going to be able to sell this amount of credits that allows them to invest into project expansion or start something new. Because it's actually very difficult, and I'm speaking as an investor who's trying to do that, or who we're trying to do that, it's very difficult for many projects to get upfront finance. It's going to be a long time until there's a retail investment product for that, because it's so risky. It's just a very risky thing in terms of project development. It's just like investing into a startup in a developing country in the end, in many cases. It's a high failure rate and a high rate of underperformance. So if you give a project and an established operator a timeline, and you say for the next few years I'm going to buy this and I'm going to buy it at a good price, they're going to have the certainty they need to develop new projects and also to get funding from other sources, as Bernardo mentioned. Like if I'm looking at a project that has an offtake for the next 5 years, I know that one side of the risk is taken away and I can provide a loan much more easily. So pay
Certainly.
and from my
yeah. Great. Yeah. I mean, I've seen sort of interest in it in the general like crowdfunding and crowd investing scene. I also agree with you that there's a lot there, and it would take a while for retail investment, but it does seem like there would be demand there. I would be interested in terms of, for like taking into example the projects that we do. So we're developing solar projects for commercial and industrial businesses. A lot of these are already built without having the idea of getting them gold standard certified in the first place. Do you think that these kind of projects would be also viable for being certified?
So again, it really depends on the scale. If it's too small, probably not. And historically, yes, they would be eligible for carbon credits. But recently, both the gold standard and the VCS have restricted their eligibility criteria of which type of projects can qualify for carbon credits. And that's mainly because in a lot of the markets, grid-connected renewables from wind and solar, the prices, the cost have dramatically reduced, and now they are really competitive. So they're no longer additional, or it would be really difficult to prove or demonstrate that additionality. So they recently changed the rules. So new projects are not allowed to or eligible for carbon credits unless they're based on least developed countries. Or there are a few of exceptions there, at least on the gold standard. But off-grid projects are still eligible, and obviously the less developed the country or community where they are taking place, the more likely are that they will remain eligible. No? And this also reflects that the market has been historically oversupplied with large wind power projects from Turkey, China, India, and other countries that might not necessarily need now that additional carbon funding. No, so it has changed, and I think it will continue to evolve over time. What's allowed and what's not allowed to claim carbon credits.
Okay. Great. I think that we are coming towards the end and in quite good time. So I would just invite any last questions. And also would be great, Amy, Johannes, and Bernardo, just to have kind of last roundup from you. So what, from your perspective, so Bernardo, for you, what is most important for companies who are looking to get their project certified? So your kind of one biggest piece of advice, and Amy and Johannes, maybe you can give this also on the buyer side.
Yeah, I would say talk first to those that have gone through the process, to give them their perspective and their experience, because yeah, you might learn quite a lot before you even start. And the documents, some of them are available, and you might be able to learn from what others have done in the past. No. And yeah, be patient and be persistent. No, I think the market, it's supposed to continue growing and bring more opportunities. But yeah, be patient and persistent.
What was the biggest challenge that you had in certifying your projects?
I think particularly this year, COVID, the restrictions for travel, that obviously makes you need to change your plans on not only how to certify, but also how to distribute. And we even went through an audit that it was done remotely from here. No, we couldn't go. But so just you need to adapt. No, and I think the next year it's still going to be a lot of adaptation there. So
yeah.
I think
some last words. Yeah.
Last words from me would be impact. That would be aligning and getting as many SDGs on the project as possible, because that at the end of the day carries a lot of weight and a lot of value with anyone buying the offsets.
Great. And Johannes?
So I think get to know the projects that you're choosing. There's a wonderful opportunity to have impacts you can't have through other means, even through private donation and philanthropy. It's hard to get such project-specific impacts and on top that are certified. And it's a beautiful way to engage employees and so on in the story of that project. So there's a lot of materials online, and these areas of the world usually get very little investment, get very little philanthropy even. So it's a beautiful way to have a direct impact on the carbon emissions, but really on much more on people's lives.
Cool. Then fantastic. This has been very enjoyable for me, so I really hope it was for all of you as well. Thank you so much for your inputs, Bernardo, Johannes, Amy. That was really valuable, and I hope that everyone watching has also been able to learn something. Thank you everyone who has attended, and for your chats and questions and engagement throughout. Yeah, it's been really interesting, and the webinar will be also available. I think you'll get an email straight after, in case you just want to watch it all again. And we'll also be putting it up on YouTube and sharing some key insights from it. So thank you again, and hoping to see you at the next event.
And thanks to you, Emma.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Emma.
Very welcome.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Ciao. Bye.